Ooh, politics. Everybody loves talking politics. And today we're talking about politics specifically aimed for kids. Am I kicking the beehive today? I think I'm kicking the bee's nest today. You've heard the angry rambles before. Why the hell are there politics in my kids' movie? This is absolute poison. How dare they introduce concepts that are clearly pushing for an agenda? It's only a recent thing anyway, based on the recent most latest political administration, or one back at most. There's never been politics in animation the entire time, surely not. No, it's only politics when we're talking about a minority being mentioned. Politics is the existence of someone not like me. That's typically the conversation you hear on the internet. I think I've covered most of those points pretty quickly and vaguely. But you see, here's the thing. That's not what we're talking about today. The fact of the matter is, politics is pretty much baked into most stories there are to consume, and if people don't think it's been a thing in the good old days, they just weren't paying attention. So what's the difference? Why is it some political topics get people all up in arms and others seem to go completely under the radar? There is a difference, and that's what we're talking about today. Not the controversial stuff of, oh, how could they do this? Also, because I disagree on how could they do this. But namely, how do you do politics well for kids to consume in an appropriate way, whilst also not enraging the general public? Because the fact of the matter is, it's done effectively more times than it isn't. From early animated classics like Pixar's The Incredibles or DreamWorks' Shrek to high-quality recent releases like Hasbro's Transformers 1, politics are an integral point of the main plot of many beloved animated films. So much so that I'd argue these films would not work at all if separated from their political themes. That said, politics are, if nothing else, divisive, and as a result, the inclusion of political ideas in media is also divisive. For screenwriters, the inclusion of political themes, particularly contemporary political ideas with a modern real impact, can be a gamble that risks alienating a portion of their audience, and this is even true in media aimed at adults. There is certainly nuance behind the inclusion of political themes, especially what themes to include and why. This is especially true in any sort of media that includes children as a large part of their intended audience. Animation is designed to have a mass appeal. Despite this, many widely celebrated animated films and TV shows manage to include these divisive political themes whilst also still being widely accepted by their all-age audiences, despite the inherent risk. By taking a deep look at a few of these acclaimed animated projects and analyzing their use of politics, we can observe the mechanics behind their successful political messaging. But let's start by taking a look at one of the most recent examples, Transformers 1. This movie, though it may have underperformed at the box office, was beloved for its strong, politically focused world building. The film focuses on a robot society that lives on the fictional planet of Cybertron, with the obvious classism between the bots on the planet serving as the driving factor of the film's conflict. The robot inhabitants of this world are split into two different classes: the ruling class of Transformers 1 and the working class of miners.
Are those miners in the race?
Whoa, hold on there, buddy. These miners are cogless, which means that unlike their elite counterpart, they are much smaller, less powerful, and unable to turn into a vehicle mode since they are born without a transformation cog. Transformers 1's political messaging is at the heart of its world building, and the movie is incredibly honest and direct with how it presents its political themes. Throughout the film, 4 cogless miner bots led by the duo who would later become Optimus Prime and Megatron uncover the truth that not only their society had been overtaken by an autocratic coup, but that the caste system that defines their world is artificial. Throughout their adventure, they discover that all sentient Cybertronians are born with cogs, and that Sentinel Prime, the corrupt leader of the ruling Transformer class, had the miners' cogs removed, strengthening the grip on the planet. Through their resistance against this corporate autocracy, the friendship between resistant fighters Optimus and Megatron is shattered, with this divide being formed from the rift between both of their differing views for the future of Cybertron and the stark contrast between their methods on how to achieve those visions. Transformers 1 is functionally a story about revolution, and it features a class revolt of the poor against their wealthy masters. It's not too unlike real-world historical events such as the French Revolution, whilst also drawing a few contemporary real-life parallels as well, though I'll leave those up to your interpretation. And mind you, this movie has a PG rating, though it does have a few instances of language that push it above the typical fully family-friendly animated affair. I'd still say it's a welcome experience for all ages, and with it being a more recent film during the times of public uproar around political topics, I think this movie comes off as a lot less subtle whilst covering a political theme that's not too personal and specific. But we're gonna go down the rabbit hole a bit more. And I think one of the main things that makes this not controversial, despite being so unsubtle, especially during these times, is because its political storytelling are true to the fictional world first and foremost. This is to say, the politics aren't being artificially inserted in, and so they're ingrained into the movie such that they are inseparable from the narrative. I think this is the first takeaway that we can have in regards to how to do politics well in animated movies without causing a fuss. This movie's successful inclusion of complex political ideas hinges on their realism to the fantasy setting it's based in. Whether it was the direct intention of the filmmakers for their film to be political or just a consequence of the story they wanted to tell, Transformers 1 lands squarely as an anti-authoritative narrative, whilst the ideas are diegetic, meaning they are occurring within the context of the story and are able to be experienced by the characters themselves. There's nothing about the political messaging in this movie that feels inauthentic or forced because it's so important to the lives of the characters themselves. And in a sense, you can put a barrier up and say, that's their problem, that doesn't necessarily reflect our problems. Another movie that does diegetic politics really well is Pixar's first Incredibles movie from 2004. Despite being made 20 years before Transformers 1, it handles the same sort of complex political themes as a vital part of its world building. While a lot of the political nuance of this movie might be lost on a kid watching who is just here for the superheroes, just like a kid watching Transformers 1 for the first time who might just be there for the cool car robots fighting, it's still very apparently there and very neatly woven into the narrative. It's funny, The Incredibles in particular is a very interesting political film, because when you think about it, it simultaneously presents both traditionally liberal and conservative themes within its narrative, and yet is widely accepted without much controversy. This is probably because, just like with Transformers 1, the politics are derived from the story being told rather than being artificially inserted. The core message of The Incredibles is honestly pretty strange compared to the normal messaging in movies aimed at kids. Instead of being a typical follow your dreams, anyone can do anything sort of story, the film's main message is about how exceptional people shouldn't be held back, and should not just be enabled, but encouraged to use their talents to stand out as above average, as the success of these incredible individuals helps the average person thrive. Which, honestly, is fair enough in this universe. I have no idea how they deal with supervillains without supers, you know? Who's gonna stop villains without them? The police? Just one super with powers that outclasses the cops, and I'm not sure that's gonna work very well. This, when looked at with a real-life political lens, is honestly an unexpectedly conservative message for a movie like this, mirroring rhetoric used to support policies such as trickle-down economics and tax cuts on the wealthy. On top of this, though the film does have an antagonist in the form of Syndrome, and trust me, we'll get to him in a minute, the true force working against the supers in this movie isn't a supervillain, but rather government overreach. By the government banning superhero activity and making the secret identities of supers their only identities, the supers essentially have their freedom of expression taken away and are made vulnerable. In seeking that better life for themselves, where they could use their superpowers and live their lives to the fullest, they fall victim to Syndrome's sinister plot. This is once again along the same lines as modern-day conservative talking points. Hey there, thank you for making it to the halfway mark of this very political essay. Congrats! Subscribe if you haven't already if you want to see kinda more stuff like this. We're doing more essays more consistently through the year now. One of the many series we're doing. Anyway, back to the second half of our dissection of politics for kids. Whew. At the same time, this movie presents more liberal ideas as well. Though the family of supers we follow in the movie long for the glory days, back when life was better pre-Super Relocation Act, Bob is presented as stuck in a corporate nightmare, stuck in a miserable commute and stuffed into a tiny white white cubicle. Bob Parr is forced to secretly navigate helping people through an insurance company designed to deny people's claims as much as possible.
Denied? You're denying my claim?
And a reminder, this movie came out in 2004. November 5th, 2004. They were exactly 20 years and 1 month prior to certain events. I am stunned. Despite the not-so-functional insurance company driven by the shareholders and corporate greed, and despite similarities to current real-world events, the creators behind The Incredibles aren't interested in these political ideas just for the politics of it. Instead, they use them specifically to further Bob's arc. Bob is stuck in a place where he not only can't stand out and help people, but he's part of a corporate system that encourages day-to-day villainy. It's a perjury for him that when he is offered a chance to break away from through a return to superwork, he immediately springs from. And at the same time, the film's villain syndrome builds his plan around taking away what makes superheroes super. Even though his methods are extreme, radical, and evil, his end goal is, in some warped sense, equality.
And when everyone's super, no one will be.
But it's not an uplifting equality as much as a mirror of the corporately bland stagnation that was shown earlier in the film, a stagnant world where nobody is special. That said, at the end of the day, selling gadgets to the general public that make superpowers affordable is probably not a truly evil action on its own. What's evil is just the path that Syndrome took to get there, and then he wants to get loads of money off of it, just classic corporate greed. Like, it might be stupid, but I wouldn't say it's inherently wrong to do that. That said, it doesn't really matter because it's not like anyone's going to be able to afford it anyway, with Bob's insurance company denying everyone's claims. The politics of this movie are front and center. Political ideas are baked into the very foundation of the Incredibles storyline at every twist and turn, and yet the film is successful, well-regarded, and relatively non-controversial. So what gives? Well, also part of it is the fact that it came from 2004. I don't think the general public were that uproariously, wanting to riot back in those days. But also, The Incredibles works because it doesn't really have a perceived agenda outside of the core message that great people should be allowed to be great. And even then, the politics of this film do not exist to bolster any real-world political cause, but rather just exist to service the story. Though there are clear comparisons to real-world situations, there is no real government overreach in America in the form of a superhero relocation act. But in the world of The Incredibles, this is a very real political idea and people respond accordingly. They can debate the fictional circumstance and still remain in character. Politics is designed to make the fantasy world more real for the audience by being true to the lives of the people that inhabit it. As far as politics goes, artificially slipping stuff under the radar to try to influence people is dumb, and even if you're not actively doing it, the problem is people's perception of you doing it. It kind of becomes a second degree of separation of people can get angry at the idea of it rather than you actually doing it. And that is where people say there is a problem in doing politics for kids, to the point that they don't even notice the politics in other movies if it makes logical sense purely for the storyline. It's the element of being non-diegetic and feeling out of place in the world of the story, pulling the audience out of the fantasy with their inclusion, that things get a little bit dicey for people. That said, a dose of real politics can strengthen the message of a film if they're a part of the world of the film. But even then, some political comparisons can actually happen entirely by accident. Take, for example, DreamWorks' Shrek. It's a pretty easy movie to draw modern political parallels with. Again though, 2001, so maybe that's the degree of separation there. And no, I'm not talking about the unhinged Shrek memes showing him kissing modern political figures. I'm talking about the actual movies here. Because looking back on it, a major event in the original Shrek is the eviction, or rather deportation, of fairy tale creatures into Shrek's swamp. This is used as a narrative device, but despite similarities to modern hot-button political issues, Shrek never draws the ire of real-world audiences over this plot point. It's not like they've never heard of deportation before in 2001, Now, the fact that this doesn't get a problem beyond the time period it came out in is probably since the goal of the scene is not to say something about a real-life issue. Instead, it's just trying to kickstart Shrek's arc by having a bunch of people show up in his swamp and break his tranquility. The politics is kind of in the background if you want to read into it more. The Incredibles doesn't have to spend a moment of its runtime babying the struggles of the Parr family for kids or explaining its politics. The stakes are very real for our superhero family. The scene where Helen explains to her children just how dangerous the bad guys are, for example, works because it's not designed to tell younger audiences how dangerous they are, it's designed as a realistic interaction between a mother and her two children in a dangerous situation. And even when we come to a modern example of The Incredibles with their sequel, they try to bake in a topic that could get people up in arms if you are the weakest possible person, in that the protagonist hero became Elastigirl, she was seen more favorably as less destructive. And also it creates a nice new conflict for Bob to actually handle the parenting. Though at the same time, perhaps you can see some of the more risk-adverse decisions of the modern day in this political climate, as so much of the nuance and political details were very much squashed away, turning it into a more generic superhero movie. Again, showing how some elements and layers of politics can really embellish a movie and take it from good to great, and great to grand. Transformers 1 shows instead of tells, with plenty of its political themes as well. General audiences don't necessarily like or dislike politics, but they for sure do not like being talked down to. And the movie never takes the time to point out how clever it is for using real-world political messagings, because the characters themselves have no reason to know anything about our real world. They're giant space robot alien people. Other times, it seems to be the unfortunate case of picking which political themes to cover, as some are simply more heated than others. It's interesting. I'd be curious to know how a modern Bugs Life movie would do, considering that movie's political themes is very starkly, again, going against that authoritarian reign. Whilst the theme that comes out of Transformers 1 could clearly be one that gets certain people all up and riled about it, in a similar way that you would see a Bugs Life perhaps doing in the modern age. It's a similar example. It unfortunately seems to be the case that if you cover topics that are a lot more personal and character-based, people will just assume that you've inserted that character into a story that otherwise doesn't make sense. And if you want to tell a story about someone being against the status quo, the way you do it is by subtle layering. If we're not talking about animation before, that can come in the form of what The Matrix is an allegory for, as well as the X-Men, as well as a million examples of someone being seen as outcast. A classic story trope that can perhaps reflect those same political themes in a way that goes over certain people's heads. Because at the end of the day, politics has always been ingrained in most stories there are to see, as for there to be a villain, there has to be a contrasting opinion that makes two characters clash. So many stories are overthrowing someone taking too much power, or banding together with your community to achieve some goal. But the times it really works best is when such politics is baked into the fiction of the world in a way that doesn't pull people out of it. Because the moment people remember the real world, the moment they start getting angry, apparently. At the end of the day, is it good to do politics for kids? Well, yeah, because it's always been there in the first place. There's just sometimes been better execution over the years that's managed to dodge controversy along the way. What matters most is authenticity. And the best part really is it's all art anyway, and art is fully up to interpretation. You can delete the politics if you want to, or you can add it yourself as well. Whew, we'll find out how much I splice up this recording in the edit. But for now, I'd best end it off there. My name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this little essay. Do tell us your thoughts on politics for kids. Oh boy, that is a spicy prompt for a comment section. How about give me good examples of politics you've seen in movies? Let's dive more into how it's done well in the past. Anyway, I shall see you all in a little bit. Bye-bye.